Um, Today talking to Dr. Laura Benjamin, which already makes me feel a bit nervous because she's obviously much more intelligent than myself. So nice to meet you again today. We a bit different to our normal meetings in the yard.
Yeah, very true. Thank you, Will. And I wouldn't put yourself down.
So Laura, just tell us a bit about your background and your title, your academic title, so we can get a bit of an idea of why we're having a chat.
Yeah, so my academic title is not very useful. It's called Principal Research Fellow, which probably means nothing to many people, but I guess it's equivalent to an associate professor. I am a neurologist, an academic neurologist, and I've been studying viruses and the brain for the last 10 years.
And then, so we randomly met how? This is where I find this quite interesting, and it makes me think back to this book, Celestine Prophecy, that you always meet someone for a reason and stuff. But it was quite a random sort of situation that brought us into contact, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely. So part of my work involves doing research in Malawi and also trying to improve the health systems. So I was out in Malawi and we all got caught in the red list crossfires unexpectedly and met each other in the airport when we got delegated to the pen.
So there were 4 of us in the pen, weren't there?
There were 3 of us from the trip, the voluntary trip that we made to Malawi, and then we met you, which is nice.
Then we met you. Thank you very much. And then we were sort of carted off in this bus, weren't we? Sort of fenced off back to this hotel where your 3 colleagues have ended up in different hotels, and we've ended up here, sort of doing our little mulled wine sessions in the yard occasionally, obviously socially distanced and taking.
Yeah, you don't probably want to tell people how much fun we had.
Yeah, exactly. But we are currently in hotel quarantine, aren't we, still? And this is our last day, isn't it? So there's a bit of sort of excitement edging in, isn't there?
Totally. A sense of liberation.
And you eventually got your second PCR test back negative. Was that this morning?
Yeah, that came in this morning. Yours came in yesterday. That added an extra layer of anxiety. But it's a relief to have it. And I just said that this whole experience has, made me appreciate the sense of freedom. And how we have that and often take it for granted. But when it's taken away from you, as we've experienced in this last week, it's quite something when you get it back.
Yeah, and I think, and we'll come on to that in terms of. So, what were you doing in Malawi? First of all, what was you and your colleagues doing?
Yeah, so we're setting up a stroke unit in Malawi, which is the first in the country, which is it's a big deal. It's something that's been brewing for many, many, many years, almost 10 years, and it's a partnership with UK institutions in London, with the Malawi Ministry of Health and the Malawi Little Wellcome Trust, and we're just trying to build from the ground up, and it's a collaboration. And 2 of the nurses from London came out there for 3 months and trying to set up the nursing infrastructure. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing. I can talk for many days about this, but I don't want to bore you.
I've noticed. I've been with you for 10 days. We have talked. But so then obviously, I was down in South Africa at the time with clients sort of coming on the way or coming back from Antarctica and stuff, and we were both caught in this sort of red list shutdown, weren't we? In terms of where the UK suddenly sort of red listed certain Southern African destinations, then added Nigeria later as well, didn't it? And so there was a sort of a mad scramble back to the UK to get in prior to the sort of quarantine hotels, which we obviously both failed to do. So here we are now sitting in 10-day hotel quarantine. But I mean, and this all relates to COVID, obviously, and you've had quite a lot of experience in COVID, as I understand it, just in terms of you've actually worked within that arena.
Yeah, so I guess with the viruses, my principal area of virus infection and studying it is HIV, which is endemic. We've worked through it and it's still a stable infection now, but still causing a lot of catastrophes. And then you have COVID, which came along and goes into the brain and causes havoc in the brain as well. So obviously, my skills transfers quite nicely into that area. And what's been quite nice with research, I'm not sure if you're aware of it from a layman perspective, but the academic world just came together in such a collaborative way to try and understand what's going on. And I've been studying infection in the brain for the last 10 years, and I think we're going to make so much more discoveries in the next 2-3 years than we will do in the next 20 years, or we have done in the last 20 years. So for research, it's an exciting time, but partly because of that collaboration and that interdisciplinary collaboration as well, which is really exciting.
And that is, and that's sort of, I don't know, when COVID started sort of over 18 months ago now, sort of, was it March 20 or similar? I think that I sort of, from the travel perspective and sort of a sort of global perspective and conservation, etc., I was hoping that there'd be a big global collaboration in terms of, global priorities changing, etc., rather than, moving away from the sort of commercial priorities that we live our lives by at the moment. You saw sort of streets empty and sort of wildlife wandering down the streets and stuff, didn't we? And it was quite exciting in a way to sort of think, hang on a minute, this could be the reset button that we need in terms of the global priorities and stuff. But I think you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of, sadly we sit here now 18 months later and I'm as guilty as the next person on it in terms of everyone's trying to crank their machines up as quickly as possible again. And the sort of lessons that COVID has sort of taught us or is continuing to teach us seem to have been forgotten. And I think when I was sitting here, can't remember what day of quarantine it was, but, I was thinking, well, actually, probably one of the only good things out of this at the moment that I can see from, as you kindly called me, from a layman's point of view, is the, is the global collaboration on the vaccines. I mean, that's it. I haven't really seen much else come out of it apart from everyone sort of going, right, back to me again. What do we do? So you think that's a massive sort of positive that's come out of it then?
Yeah, much more than that. I think I know the desperation for normality, and I definitely feel that. I think it's an instinctive thing as a human being to want to go back to normal. And I guess that's why we were caught up in the crossfire, because this pandemic is way from over. And that rush to go back to where we were, which is probably going to take a lot longer, was pushed forward, and hence why we got caught out at, so much expensive to us, emotional expense and financial expense. So there is that push and pull between wanting to go back to normal and not accepting the reality of where we are with this virus, and, trying to put contingencies in place so that when we need to flip back, we can do it without causing too much catastrophe and damage. But in terms of collaboration, vaccine definitely, but with everything there's inequity, as we can go on forever talking about. But in terms of I think I can talk from a neurology point of view and neuroscience point of view, because I'm part of one of the biggest funded projects that's currently going on in the UK, which is called the COVID CNS. And that's the UK government giving them £2.8 million to try and understand what goes on with COVID and the brain, because we know many people have from very simple terms, headaches and fatigue, to more severe forms like strokes and inflammatory brain disorders, and then to more kind of difficult, softer things, but equally debilitating, long COVID, where people are wiped out and not able to function like they do before. So this is neurologists, neuroscientists, psychologists, neuroradiologists, so, all the different disciplines in neurology, neuroscience sphere coming together to try and understand it, and not just at individual institutions, but as a national program. I'm not leading it, but one of my colleagues in Liverpool and also in King's are leading it. And that's just an example of that interdisciplinary research I was talking about, but also the collaboration. And things are going on more in the global sphere as well. That's just the UK.
This obviously plays to your sort of strengths, etc., in terms of your expertise, and without putting you on the spot, it's your perspective, and everyone has different perspectives and opinions, etc. You say that we may be sort of rushed back into this, and that it's sort of, there's still sort of potentially quite a long way to go. Do you want to just sort of try and, how can you qualify that in terms of, obviously, I mean, not from your expertise, but in terms of what does it look like for you? What is the sort of, is there a new normal, or, what, and if so, what does it look like?
It's a very difficult question to answer. what we know is that, you had the pandemic with SARS-CoV-1 in the early 2000s in Southeast Asia. And then we have this different family, but very similar virus causing a problem. And I guess the difference between the two is that one, when you got SARS-CoV-1 and you were symptomatic with it. So it gave that warning to people that I've got an infection. So it's easy to isolate and move on. The challenge with this virus that we have is that you have a week period where you're asymptomatic. So you're not revealing to people, I've got this infection. You feel normal in yourself. So it's very easy to spread. And that's contributed to why it has spread so quickly and led to such a pandemic. And then you have to remember that about 80% of the population who get SARS-CoV-2 are fine and are okay. Is that 20%, which is significant if you think about it in real numbers. That period where it can infect people when you're not aware and has the ability to keep on spreading. And with that in mind, we are a naive host, so we're not exposed. We haven't been exposed to this virus before, so our body's adjusting to it. Our body's developing antibodies, but the virus is also, from what we understand, the virus it's probably made a jump from, well, arguably a jump from an animal or a lab, but we are naive to it, and the virus is trying to adapt itself as well to a new host. And when it arrives in our body, and I guess in the sense of background, the virus needs energy source to survive. So when it comes into us, we provide that energy source, and it's that push and pull between antibody or immunity, getting rid of it and clearing it away, that we have to battle through when we get our illnesses. And most of the time we succeed. And then you have situations where you can't battle it so well because your immune system is not so great. And you have lots of scenarios where that can arise. People with cancer, people with HIV, in Southern Africa, people who are on immunosuppressive drugs for any description, whether it be rheumatoid arthritis, which is quite common. And
so is that sort of, sorry to interrupt, but is that really sort of, because we've chatted about it quite a lot over the last 10 days, haven't we, in terms of how different parts of the world have been treated in terms of the red lists that have been imposed now. We can look at that, but also in terms of how the rollout of vaccines, etc., have been dealt with. In terms of, I'm quite disappointed in how the UK has acted in this, in terms of one of the first things we did when COVID hit was pull African aid, and then we under-delivered on the pledge of vaccines to Africa as well, and now we're in a situation which obviously you know more about than myself, but where supposedly another variant has come from southern African destinations, which is through no one's fault, etc. But we're pretty quick to sort of point the finger when we've just pulled all the Western world has pretty much just pulled all the support that we were potentially offering, But that really links into what you were just saying in terms of sort of the various immune system issues, etc. And you were saying is that why it's an issue more in Southern Africa, because of the HIV problem that there has been there in the past and there continues to be, obviously? But is that one of the contributing factors?
Yeah, it's so complex.
And is that why we need to sort of prioritize vaccinating the world rather than just the Western world?
And certainly we need to prioritize vaccinating the world because, as I say, between that balance of your own immunity and the virus, if you can't clear it, whether it be augmented by vaccination or yourself, then you're not going to do well. But also, if you do well, the virus will stay in your body for a lot longer and mutate. And that mutation is exactly the situation that we are in, or we have seen with Delta and now with Omicron, which becomes problematic. But we've got to a situation here because these variants are forming in regions where there's a bigger population, where the immunity is not so strong. And as a result, the virus is allowed to keep on mutating until it becomes even a more effective virus, and then spills back into the human population, and then becomes more transmissible and may potentially cause harm. We're not sure yet whether how much harm omicron will cause, but there will be another virus that will cause more harm. So if we
virus or another variant in terms of, or either.
Well, it's either, because when you keep on mutating and changing yourself, you start deviating from the main clone, in sense of simplifying it. So it may become another virus, because it's so distinctly different. But yeah, it will start off as a variant, but will become another virus.
So what is the solution then? In terms of, I know that's a very simplistic question, from the layman myself, to the academic. But what is the solution to it in terms of, we've just got to, do we need to let it run and adapt, or do we need to vaccinate and try and crush it? What's the...
Yeah, so the solution with many things is that this is a global problem. And we need to treat it as a global problem.
And we're not at the moment.
And we're not. As in, everyone is working on it as a state problem or a country problem.
Yeah.
And then that augments the inequality even more so. The Omicron variant, I think, is just an example of what will happen if we don't tackle this as a global problem.
So what, in terms of, and this sort of leads me on, obviously my background is in travel, but one of the biggest frustrations, apart from the government not really showing any support to the travel industry for the last 18 months, don't get me started on that, is in terms of, we've just seen sort of the British government just red list Southern African destinations, and that's it. Whereas, hang on a minute, there were, I think it was 61 people on a flight in Amsterdam that were, that were tested positive for COVID, etc. Well, just taking that as an example, Holland is still not on a red list, etc. When you say we've got to look at it as a global problem, how do we do that? Why are only some destinations on a red list? I don't want to go down that route, but in terms of, it does start making you think that Africa is treated differently to the Western world, and we sort of prioritize things on our Western world doorsteps in terms of Black Lives Matter. But then you look at how people have acted now, and it's like, hang on a minute, guys, come on, what's going on? And I can hear you snickering in the background or laughing in the background, because these are contentious issues.
We're just we're getting lots of political points in one sentence.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't want to go too political, but obviously they are political. They turn into political issues as well, whether you want them to or not. And I'm just pretty shocked at how we've acted to date. So why are we doing it?
Well, I go back to the point that this is a global problem and needs to be dealt with as a global issue. But unfortunately, the global entities that can lead such management in such a pandemic are people like the WHO, but effectively they don't have the power that they need to exercise this as a global management strategy. But you have a virus, the virus is infective. What you need to do is have different strategies in dealing with it. One, prevent transmission, and that is with isolation strategies. And part of that is with appropriate diagnostics so that you can, recognize it and put people away. And that comes with really optimized public health interventions. We're lacking in that. Let's say, for example, in the UK, we're not so good at that. And the investment hasn't been put into that area. The other is vaccination. So you vaccinate people, but mindful that with vaccination, which we're seeing with Omicron, is that the virus can mutate and it may escape the vaccination. And Chris Whitty said way before that he anticipates that we will probably have to have annual vaccinations like we do with influenza. That's one situation. And the other one is when they come into hospital, recognizing, treating and managing them, having antiviral treatments, which they're now developing, and that's now available. And that's another situation. The reality is that what in the best scenario, you do a combination of all those things. But many countries are banking on one or the other and not the whole thing. And as a result, when situations that catch them off guard in their control occurs, like the Omicron, they react quite, as a knee-jerk reaction because they're caught off guard. Whilst if you know that the virus can do this, if you can predict that these variants will arise, or you can vaccinate the world to limit these variants arising, It's somewhat like prevention, political or not. It's if they have that oversight, which means making a lot of sacrifices that may not be palatable to people, making compromises on commercial entities, but that may not be, taken so well. But in the longer term, it will limit a lot of these knee-jerk reactions and complications that we're getting now, which makes it even more destructive, I think, rather than knowing these variants may occur, investing more in vaccinating the world, because if we don't vaccinate the world, the variants are going to occur in the unvaccinated population, and focusing more on public health interventions and trying to mitigate things that way that are behaviorally acceptable as well, and working with the community to do that. And that requires investment in money, but sometimes people make choices on what they want to invest in and what trade-offs they're willing to take.
Because there is a massive trade-off, isn't there, in terms of going into further lockdowns or limiting people's sort of social interaction, etc. That does have a massive knock-on effect in other areas, etc. And I don't, we haven't really seen what the impact of that is yet, have we? It's much too early to tell, don't you think? Obviously, there's the short term, but there's going to be a much longer term sort of effect of that as well, isn't there?
Yeah, but simple things like mask wearing, no one likes it, but actually I'll rather wear a mask for the next 3-4 years, knowing that it will reduce the risk of me having to go into lockdown. Yeah. And there's studies that show that it does work. If you had the option of a lockdown where, I think not dissimilar to where we had it in July last year in the UK, where you're allowed to interact in homes, but limited numbers. You're allowed to go to restaurants, but limited numbers indoors, and you're allowed a bit more of interaction outdoors. I think most people were fine with that, knowing that it will reduce the risk of their loved ones dying, and also it will reduce the knee-jerk reactions that can be quite disruptive to life. And
so do you think that's what we're looking at for the next sort of 6-12 months, variety of sort of different sort of societal restrictions?
Yeah, as in, we don't need the restriction we had in the first surge. That was excessive, but that was partly because there was so much unknowns.
Yeah.
So an extreme lockdown will never look like how it did last time. An extreme lockdown will probably actually still not take away our civil liberties and actually still give us some degree of independence. Flying should still be possible, not excessive quarantine like this that we're doing at an excessive cost, but something that's sensible and agreeable. In Norway, you quarantine in a hotel for 3 days, you test negative, and then you go home and do the rest of the quarantine there. Things are a bit more acceptable, and it's still isolating the virus, but you just need a good community system to ensure that is undertaken.
So the hotel quarantine that we've undergone now, obviously, is slightly confusing because it was dropped on us, sort of within 48 hour period, by the government. And obviously we've sat here and we've obliged whilst Downing Street are having Christmas parties, it appears, last year.
Let's not do that.
But we're doing what we're told. Is this hotel quarantine, is it excessive? Is it required? Or are there simpler and better ways of doing it? I appreciate that there needs to be limits put in place and then controls put in place, but this seems a bit excessive.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think a strategy of of government quarantine is needed, but I think there needs to be transparency of who falls into that category. And at the moment, as we both feel, it's that I came from Malawi, where there is no Omicron there, and it feels as if this is completely unjustified and not right. And the virus, this variant is in the UK. It seems excessive. There just needs to be transparency on why people are in the red list, the reason, the rationale, the justification, and that transparency be clear across all nations. And I think if that is there, there'll be much more buy-in to this. Essentially, you just need to isolate. You need to isolate. How you isolate it is a choice of individual nations. But then some are acceptable, some are not. But for us, it's tricky to palate because it's not necessarily justified. The countries that we came from should have been on the red list, and also the cost been inflicted on us when we went to these countries with if we went to these countries knowing that this is a red list country, and then having to, then you've electively made that choice, but being caught off guard like that based on a knee-jerk reaction, really, you lose faith in the system, and that they are not being sensible about this, or based on evidence.
Situation we're in as a result of these countries being, Southern African nations being put on the red list. Maybe simplifying it again, but should they have been put on the red list in terms of, what we're seeing worldwide?
Again, I think there needs to be transparency on the rationale of why they did that, and that was not clear. South Africa,
and that's also been the case with a lot of African destinations since the beginning of COVID, if we're honest. And I'm saying that from my perspective in terms of, working within the travel industry. You look at destinations like Namibia, where there's huge sort of empty spaces and a very low population, a very low COVID sort of infection rate, etc. But everyone has been lumped in the same basket, and I find that personally difficult to sort of comprehend. And I'm not trying to sort of slant anything here. I just find it very strange that everything, people still sort of see Africa as one country. It's not. It's a continent. And there are huge differences in different geographical areas, regions, populations, and everything.
And effectively, the flow of between countries, the reason for these red listing and I don't think they do amber listing anymore, but whatever equivalent of red listing is to try and limit the spread of variants that will escape the immune system and ruin programs that are functioning well and beautifully in countries that have made a lot of investments in. So, for example, UK, they vaccinate a lot of their population. They don't want another variant coming in that will take them back to square one.
Yeah.
So, their reaction was reasonably, probably arguably justified, because they're scared that this variant will come in and cause destruction, and they reacted that way. If countries have the capabilities to do these sequencings and show they haven't got the variants, then I guess that's a transparency of saying, if you've got a variant, we will restrict for a period of time to try and slow things down so that we can be prepared, because we know it's going to come inevitably, but we have time to prepare and be aware and have more public health strategies in our countries so that we're aware of it. But it's just that transparency that's missing, and that's not clear at the moment.
So what, and this is obviously a tricky question now, because I think you'll say it's too early to tell, but the Omicron, well, first of all, what happened to all the variants between Delta and Omicron? Were they just sort of, they weren't too bad then, obviously. And then secondly, sorry?
So presumably.
Yeah. And then secondly, Omicron, from what we know so far, how bad is it? From the little information that I've picked up from the media and sort of read around it, etc., it seems to be potentially more infectious, but not as fatal. And I think it's very difficult to say at the moment, isn't it? But I'd just be interested to hear your sort of take on that.
Yeah, too early to say.
Yeah. You're not walking into that one, no. Exactly.
To keep it simple, too early to say. There are hints that it might be milder, but I think it's too early to say.
And how long does it take until then it's sort of a 4-week process to sort of look at it and the effects, etc.?
Yeah, because you have to remember there's an age dynamic as well. So the people who are driving the infection at the moment are younger people who generally do quite well anyway with the infection. So It's only on to wait for that infection to hit that, the over 60s. Would we really know whether this is going to be a milder infection or more severe? So that's why it's too early, because the age structure is affecting the moment for people who do generally get milder symptoms.
So okay, no, that's fair enough. And I know it's very difficult. So, so to sort of end on a really simple question, going back 18 months, in terms of where did COVID come from? Was it a lab? Was it a natural sort of phenomenon coming from sort of human wildlife encroachment and the wet markets, etc. And obviously I'm sort of saying this tongue in cheek a bit, but we obviously work a lot in the conservation side, etc. And I always say, rather sort of I don't know, nonchalantly or whatever, in terms of the only problem that we have in the world is overpopulation, and it's that encroachment on natural areas and natural resources, etc., that brings about things like this, and until we learn to deal with our natural world and the planet differently, we're going to continue to have these issues and these problems. I'm probably more a believer that it came from sort of that natural encroachment rather than the sort of a top secret lab or something like that. but I don't know. What do you think? What's your sort of take on
it? So, in response to your very simple question, don't know. Who knows? But I think the point that you make is, with climate change, is all interlinked. Because as deforestation occurs, as you displace wild animals and they start moving closer and closer to human habitat, you're going to get jump of infections from animal host to human beings. Pandemics were always predictable. I'm funded by the Wellcome Trust, and they changed it. They brought in Jeremy Farrar, and he's someone who's done work in Southeast Asia and has spent, he was very much in leading SARS-CoV-1. I don't think it's a coincidence that he's now become the director of the Wellcome Trust about 7 years ago. I don't think it's a coincidence that he's changed the strategies to focus on climate change, mental health, and infection epidemics. I don't think it's a coincidence that Bill Gates talked about we need to be careful because there's going to be another pandemic. So this is just one example. This is probably the early warning sign of this is what can happen and how this can be so destructive. I made a slip about another virus. That's a Freudian slip, because there will be another virus. That's inevitable. And if we can't sort out ourselves and work collectively to deal with this, whether it be through climate change or whether it be through just dealing with a pandemic in a consensus voice, then we're going to have this problem again and again and again.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfect note to finish on. So very simple subject to discuss, isn't it? But thank you very much for your time, Dr. Laura Benjamin. It's a privilege chatting to you, and I'll see you in the yard for a glass of mulled wine in a minute.